So we are going to look at a passage out of Romans 14 today. So just a little on context. The book of Romans, Paul is writing to people he did not know. He'd never met these people, which is a little unique compared to all the other things. The big problem seemed to be kind of fighting culturally between two people in the churches there. The Jewish Christians had been kicked out at one point. One of the emperors blamed them for something, so they all got kicked out. The church got big with Gentiles while they were gone, and they came back, and there's just a lot of cultural differences there. They didn't really get one another and their ways of following God. So he's writing about unity and looking past some of those things that the world might say should divide us. The other kind of big thing in here is Paul was hoping to continue on in his missionary work to what's now Spain. And we actually don't know if he ever made it or not, which is kind of interesting. That this book of Romans was actually supposed to be kind of a mission statement, a letter. But his actual purpose, he thought the point was to get some money to head to Spain. We don't know if he made it or not. It's actually unimportant because we got Romans out of it. A pretty dense, important book, which I think is just a good reminder that Paul didn't probably know this was going to be his most famous work, one of the biggest, most influential things he did with his life at the time. He thought this was kind of a side note of what he was hoping to do. It felt like the mission to him. So just a reminder that we don't always know the spiritual significance of the things we're doing. Because God has used this one a bit over the years. The controversy in this section that he's talking about, as far as we can tell, has to do with vegetarianism and special days. We're not exactly sure what they're being argued about and who the strong and the weak people are. Some people think the issue is eating kosher. Some people think it's like in Corinthians, the idea of is this meat being coming from idol worship. Some people think the exact opposite. These were actually the Gentiles who didn't want to eat meat because vegetarianism was very common in Neoplatonism and some of the other ones that thought the body was bad. So the more you can starve the body, the more spiritual you are. So all that comes down to, despite what anyone will tell you, we don't actually know what they were arguing about. It's vague, which probably tells you about how important the details are when we're arguing a lot of the time, right? So that's kind of the background as we go into this. I'm going to just start at verse 1, go through 12. Welcome the person who is weak in faith, but not in order to argue about differences of opinion. One person believes in eating everything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Those who eat must not look down on the ones who don't. The ones who don't eat must not judge the ones who do, because God has accepted them. Who are you to judge someone else's servants? They stand or fall before their own Lord, and they will stand because the Lord has the power to make them stand. One person considers some days to be more sacred than others, while another person considers all days the same. Each person must have their own convictions. Someone who thinks that a day is sacred thinks that way for the Lord. Those who eat, eat for the Lord, because they thank God. Those who don't eat for the Lord. They thank the Lord too. We don't live for ourselves. We don't die for ourselves. If we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or we die, we belong to God. This is why Christ died and lived, so that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Why do you judge your brother or your sister? Or why do you look down on your brother and sister? We all stand in front of the judgment seat of God, because it's written, "As I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow to me, and every tongue give praise to God." So then each of us will give an account of ourselves to God. So the issue here, he does have a few kind of quick comments on who might be right in this argument, right? But largely this section, he's kind of coming down on both of them. Whether you're right in this argument or not doesn't matter, because you have broken unity. You are looking down on someone else. You think you are more spiritual and more special, blah, blah, than they are. So whether you are right or wrong in the end doesn't matter. You've broken unity with your brothers and your sisters. And so he's starting to kind of rebuild this relationship that seems to be broken here. And he does it, I love just how simple and actionable his first verse is. Welcome the person who's weak in faith. They probably both thought the other person was weak in faith, right? Well, tough. Welcome them. The word welcome, I think, is important because this is not some official top-down stance from a teacher. We will tolerate those people because we have to, right? Yeah, we may not like them, but at least put up with them. And I think that's what lurks behind a lot of our love of difference nowadays. We kind of know the official stance. We're supposed to tolerate each other at least. But here the word is welcome, which is related to hospitality. It's not the same as being civil in like a public debate, right? There's rules of how you're allowed to talk to one another. We're not in a culture anymore you get to duel with people after a public debate because you disagree with them, although maybe you're heading that direction. But at the end of the day, if you're in a public space, there are a bunch of set rules. It does not change your relationship with the person you're arguing with. There's some ways to help you guys tolerate one another. There's some ways you're allowed to speak with one another. But you can walk away from that conversation with every bit of disdain you have for them and their position as you started with in the evening. I think that's the problem with a lot of our public debate. And that's not what he says. Don't go into public debate. Don't argue kindly. He says welcome the person you disagree with. Welcome them into your home. Welcome them into your life. Because it's a lot harder to hold someone at arm's length when they are in your house, they are your guest. You're worrying about their needs and their wants, making sure they're comfortable, right? You see them differently. I don't really know what that looks like right now during COVID. But it needs to look like something. Hospitality, welcoming people, truly welcoming them into our hearts and our lives is really different than putting up with one another. Because they've been doing a lot of that. And it wasn't working. I think in some of the commentaries I ran into the word, this is one of the best ways to avoid letting disdain build up in our hearts. I'm very sensitive to that word disdain. Because one of my seminary professors grew up in Croatia in the 90s. He got to see where the term ethnic cleansing was, that term was coined when he was a teenager in his early 20s. He saw the slaughter there. And he said where it got started was long before people were willing to kill each other in the streets was disdain. He said that is where you see it starting. When you see another person and think less of them as a human being, when you see them as an object, you begin the road that lets you do things like that later on. And so when I saw kind of offhandedly someone say, welcoming a person who's weak in faith, who's different from you, is a practical, day-to-day way to keep disdain from building up in our hearts and our lives, that strikes me as pretty important. Especially right now. The issue we look at is in 2 through 5. Again, we know it has something to do with special days and vegetarianism, but there have been really smart, deep people who have felt that the Gentiles were on one side, the Jews were on one side. There's people who flipped that. There are people who think neither of those groups is being talked to. Again, I think that's important because Paul gets into the details, because what we argue about is important, right? We're not fighting about nothing, or no one would fight about it. But it's not as important as we make it. That's why all these years later, we don't really care. Just like we won't really care in a handful of years, hopefully, about many of the things we're fighting about amongst ourselves now. One person believes in eating everything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Those who eat must not look down on the ones who don't. The ones who don't eat must not judge the ones who do, because God has accepted them. Who are you to judge someone else's servants? They stand or they fall before their own Lord, and they will stand, because the Lord has the power to make them stand. One person considers some days to be more sacred than others, while another person considers all days to be the same. Each person must have their own convictions. It seems to me that we've kind of got two sides in here. One is probably leaning toward rules. One is probably leaning towards freedom, right? Getting to do what I want, having my own convictions. And like in most arguments, you can they tend to pick on the gross worst of each side. So I think on the rules side, obviously they're accusing each other of legalism, right? Of kind of this cold pettiness, of worrying about the crossing T's and dotting I's when that's not really what it's about. But I think if we're going to be generous, people are attracted to rules because they want something that is practical, right? They want something that's concrete. Say, this is what I can do and what I can't do. And so maybe someone who leans toward that, we need to have a little bit more grace and say, at the end of the day, they're maybe trying to do this practically, get it out of the abstract. And maybe we should see if we can help one another not let it slip into something cold and hard and legalistic. The other side, I think, if you're gonna make fun of it, the freedom side of, you say, oh, you're just saying that because you wanna just justify what you do anyway, right? It's all actually about self-indulgence. You're just saying that because you just want to do what you want to do. It's all about you, right? Or maybe the more grace-filled version is they want responsibility. They want to take what they've been given by God and actually run with it, rather than have someone else tell them how to live their life. I think they both have a place. I think the sweet spot is when, we're looking for the concrete and practical, but not letting it degrade into legalism. And we are taking responsibility that God has given us for our own faith and living that out. And we are not indulging ourselves. We are not just looking for excuses to do what we want to do. We're actually taking responsibility. And so I think that's a spectrum that we all need each other for. And I think it's a spectrum that we need each other for, especially when we're fighting. We should lay into each other's strengths instead of fighting about it. Take just a second to think about what it would look like to actually approach some of the issues in our churches, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in politics. What would it look like to actually approach people whom we disagree with? Not as the weak brother or sister, but as someone we welcome into our lives who probably has a perspective that can aid us in some way. But at the end of the day, the argument isn't that we should tolerate one another or learn from one another, right? The actual crux of the argument, I think, comes in this next section, 6-9. Someone who thinks that the day is sacred thinks that way for the Lord. Those who eat, eat for the Lord, because they thank God. And those who don't eat, they eat to the Lord, and they thank the Lord too. We don't live for ourselves. We don't die for ourselves. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we belong to God. This is why Christ died and lived, so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. The claim that if all of these people who don't manage to get along are Christ's, if he is the one who has the perspective to judge, puts us in a really different place, a frustratingly different place at times, because God and Christ seems to hold a diversity of personalities and cultures and of ways of relating to him. He seems to own and hold and value some really different streams of discipleship, some very different ways of doing worship, some very different ways of thinking and feeling your relationship to God and one another and the church. And I think the goal here is pointing out at the end, we're going to give an account of ourselves to God. So I think the question is an introspective one, right? Okay, where I grew up, who I grew up around, my personality, my experience, my way of relating to God. Am I doing that responsibly? Am I following Him rightly with my set of circumstances and thoughts? Am I willing to be stretched and challenged by God, by others, by culture, by so many other things? We bear responsibility for who we are, not other people. And yet how much of the time do we spend looking at other people, their way of doing things, and making sure, even if we don't say it to them, that we know they're wrong, because that's what proves us right. But if we, I think, are living into this freedom that is offered here, that we are Christ's, we don't need to look at everyone else and tear them down to justify who we are and what we do. They can do it differently and well at the same time. We don't always know. And it's frankly not up to us to always know. But can we say with confidence, yeah, based on the cards I've been dealt in life, I'm following as best I can. And trusting the Spirit knows that. Being okay with it. Because I think when we are trusting in His evaluation of us, that we are Christ's, good, bad, and ugly, we are Christ's. And it says in here that He will hold us up. They will stand because the Lord gives them power to stand. We get to be free from others' evaluation. We get to be free of our own evaluation of us. We don't have to care about our insecurities. We don't have to care about what everyone else says about us. That's not their call. It's not our call. It's Christ's call because we belong to Him. And so I think when that is the core of what we're living into, we know whose we are. This kind of section that just ends up saying don't judge, it becomes kind of an afterthought. So, well, yeah. Judging is a means, it's not an end. And I think the unhealthiness of judgment will wither when we know whose we are, when we don't feel the need to tear down others, to call that building ourselves up, right? When we know whose we are, we don't have to do that anymore. We can welcome. We can invite. We can be okay with a lot of ambiguity and gray in the other ways people relate to God and the ways they follow. We can even sometimes be challenged and learn from them without having to draw a line and exclude them. We're God's. We're invited to being free from the us versus them. We're invited to be free.